Good afternoon, and thank you all for participating in the Extended Day Ahead Market Working Group 3 meeting. This one is related to the supply and resource sufficiency evaluation. This is Christina Osborne from ISO's Stakeholder Engagement Group. I'll be providing support for the meeting, and Mark Richardson is the facilitator, and Bob Cott is the particular working group. And Phil Pettingale is the coordinator overseeing all 3 of the EDAM working groups. See all of them listed as panelists. Just a heads up that all the phone lines are unmuted. That's to allow for open dialogue throughout the meeting. So please remember to mute your line if you have a question. So as noted on this slide, this group meets on Mondays and Wednesdays from 1 to 3. The participation details for each of the meetings can be found on the public calendar on ISO's website. So after I go over the introduction, I will turn the meeting over to Mark to quickly review the scope items and then go over the proposed order of topics. And then George Angelidi, Principal of Power Systems Technology Development here at the ISO, will provide a foundational overview and review the purpose of RSC. He'll turn it back over to Mark to review the advisory showing principle and lead a group discussion on that topic. And then at the end of the meeting, Bob Cott will recap the meeting discussion. Mark will go over the topic for the meeting on Monday. Quick reminders before I turn it over to Mark. So these working groups are collaborative and intended to foster open dialogue and sharing of ideas and perspectives. And to help for open dialogue, as a participant, you should have the ability to unmute your line, but please reach out to either the event producer or myself if you have any issues. And when not speaking, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any background noise. So even though you are able to speak freely, we ask that you still raise your hand to help manage the discussion and to state your name and affiliation so that the rest of the knows who's speaking. The working group is recorded and video files posted on the corresponding working group web pages, and please request permission from the ISO before reprinting these transcriptions. And stakeholders are welcome to present their perspectives at these meetings, so if you are interested, please submit a request to using the link located on the resources slide at the end of this presentation. And all of the meeting materials related to this group are available on the related page, and that link is also included on that EDAM resource slide of the presentation. So again, just a reminder, the phone lines are unmuted, so please remember to manually mute your line so that we don't hear any background conversations or noise. So with that, I'll turn the meeting over to Mark Richardson.
Thank you, Christina. Can you confirm you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
All right, next slide, please. Perfect. Well, good afternoon, everyone. As always, we definitely appreciate your participation and look forward to making further progress in this EDAM effort. So for today's objectives, I'd like to quickly review those scope item updates that we had from the previous conversation, go through what I believe to be a logical order of topics to discuss in the coming months. I'll have George review the purpose of the RSC, and I want to acknowledge on the previous call, there was definitely some foundational questions regarding how resources in the EDAM BAA should participate and what their obligations are to participate. So George is here to really provide that quick level overview on what that looks like to kind of help set the foundation. I understand we're going to touch on several of those elements throughout the discussion, and I would like those to come up organically as we tackle those various topics. I'm then going to pull up the principles for advisory showing, walk through that, go through the intent of that principle for the advisory showing, and then really start discussing more information and what it looks like, what that advisory showing looks like, what the forecast is going to be, how is that determined, what the advisory showing needs to include, what type of resource information, if any, really trying to build out what that template looks like. And then lastly, the transparency around it, right? Where are we going to provide that information? What are we going to do with it? So with that, let's go to the next slide, Christina. All right, so before I go through the proposed order for discussion, in the last call, there were really 3 main takeaways from the scope topic update. One was around treatment of will-through transactions and its implications to the resource sufficiency evaluation and EDAM transfers. The second were some additions to the qualification of resources as it pertains to counting and qualifying. And then lastly, some of the resource evaluation input, consideration of forecast accuracy, how that forecast would be updated or tuned, timing of those updates, is there going to be an error percentage threshold, and means for correction. So we captured those in those topics. We will work to update those topics out on the website when we can. Those topics are by no means set in stone, so as we walk through them, I'm sure there's going to be more questions that arise and topics that we got to tackle. I am getting some feedback, so if you don't mind muting your line, I'd appreciate it. Fantastic, thank you. All right, so proposed order for discussion. Oh, I'm sorry, did I hear somebody? All right, thank you for muting. All right, so as I mentioned in Monday's call, I really, looking through the scope items, I really see this broken down into three main areas: the advisory showing, the resource efficiency evaluation, and EDAM transfers. I wanted to propose to the group that we tackle these scope items in this order. I'm going to pause there and see if I can get a reaction to that, if that makes sense. I think the advisory showing, we don't necessarily have to nail down what types of resources qualify, what goes into the forecast, but really just kind of define what that advisory showing looks like, what the intent was, and what level of transparency we want to have. And then we'll let the resource sufficiency evaluation conversation of scope of topics really define what gets included in that advisory showing. So let me pause there, see if I can get a reaction, or if someone from the audience like to chime in and provide any other questions or information.
And please, if you could raise your hand, that'll just help us manage the discussion better. And also, if you're not, please remember to mute your line. So go ahead, Mark. Looks like we do have some names.
Thank you, Christina. I see Alva in the queue.
Please
introduce yourself.
Sure, Alva Svoboda, PG&E. This is just really a foundational question. What is what do you consider to be the equivalent in the CAISO day-ahead market of the advisory showing?
You said the equivalent day-ahead market of the advisory showing. So this advisory showing was really go ahead.
Well, you're setting up, so in an analogy to the IFM and RUC, what is the equivalent to the advisory showing that you are proposing for EDAM?
Yeah, so going back to some of those, so it was RA-like, right? We had that 45-day showing in advance. It was one of the core common principles that we landed on. So that's really where that came from. And we'll go through the principle again and get into the intent of that.
Is there any equivalent in the period immediately before the day-ahead market runs currently in the IFM and RUC?
So I think those are some of the details we will actually work out from an equivalent standpoint.
So you'd say probably there's not an exact equivalent currently in the ISO only market. Okay, great. That's all I wanted to know. Thank you.
Yep, not a problem. Callie, I see your hands up. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Callie Wells with WPTF. So just one suggestion. I know George is going to jump on and kind of level set a little bit here in a minute, which we really appreciate, because I think based on the meeting discussion 2 days ago, that was something that I think everyone could use, just kind of level setting up front. But one suggestion is maybe an additional topic that might need to come sooner rather than later before we do get into the details is kind of everyone agreeing and understanding, kind of, for lack of a better term here, what are the participation rules? I know, for example, one of the topics that came up 2 days ago was, this whole voluntary versus mandatory participation. So in the CAISO load, there isn't a requirement anymore for load to bid in 100% of its forecast in the day ahead. Is that going to also be applied to EDAM BAs or EDAM BAs or not? So just kind of at a very high level, going through those foundational questions, concepts, and having a big picture, I guess, agreement up front that will then facilitate these discussions and the three topics that you have here a little bit easier.
Yeah, thank you, Callie. And I think when George does that level setting, I think we'll get a sense of what that participation looks like, and we could definitely address some of those questions to the extent you still have some there.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. So is there any comments or thoughts on the proposed order of topics and how we'd like to proceed in the coming months in Working Group 1 here? If I don't get any other feedback on this order of topics, once we do the level setting, we're going to dive right in today on that advisory showing and hopefully hammer out some of those details. Jeff? Go ahead, Jeff.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. It's Jeff Nelson, SCE. On EDAM transfers, I think we just need to be cognizant that there's a whole wheel-through process going on in a different forum, and it's not quite clear how the output of that process will become an input into this process. So I just think we need to be conscious of that.
Absolutely. All right, next slide, Christina. All right, so George, would you like to provide the quick high-level overview of what participation looks like in EDAM and then transition into resource sufficiency evaluation purpose?
Yes, thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, everyone. This is George Angelidis. Before I walk through this slide here on the resource sufficiency evaluation, I would like to take a few moments to go over some fundamental questions that we have been receiving the last few calls regarding participation in EDAM. What does it mean? How it is materializing, and all these questions about mandatory or voluntary participation. So I'd like to take a few moments here to walk through some fundamentals and set a base so that we can move forward on these issues. So when we talk about EDAM participation, there are really three areas that I can see in EDAM participation. One area is about BAA participation. Another area is about resource participation for the resources in these BAAs, and also by extension to external resources outside of the EDAM footprint. And then transmission participation. So let's walk over these concepts a little bit to set a base. So for BAA participation, we have always said that participation in EDAM is voluntary for any BAA that is already in EIM. So there is a prerequisite that a BAA that wants to participate in EDAM must be participating in EIM, because we want to have the sequence of settlements going from the day-ahead market to the meter that is the ultimate measure of energy production or consumption for final settlement. So there has to be this sequence. But for every BAA that is in EIM, participation in EDAM is voluntary. Now, once an EIM BAA participates or decides to participate in EDAM, there is a level of commitment that is expected. So the participation will be for some minimum amount of time. It wouldn't be good for the market, for the stability of the market, to have BAAs participating one day, not participating the next, etc. I hope this is well understood, and this is a similar concept that we have in EIM. Participation in EIM is also voluntary, but it's a form of commitment for 6 months. Now, how the commitment for EDAM is going to be, how long, etc., this is going to be part of the discussions in the working groups, of course, but some level of commitment is expected for that voluntary BAA participation in EDAM. So that's about BAA participation. Let's move on to the other topic of what does it mean resource participation. Now, you're a resource within the EDAM BAA. What does it mean to participate or not participate? So for this, we have to realize that everything in the market is driven by bids. This is how the market operates. So, and by bids, I don't mean only economic bids, but also soft schedules, which is a form of a bid. It's a price taker bid. So participation at the resource level is really declared in terms of submitting bids to the market. We run the resource sufficiency evaluation using these bids, and we run the market using these bids. So when a resource participates, it submits bids. If a resource does not submit bids in the market, then it doesn't participate. Now, there is a distinction between voluntary and mandatory participation when it comes to resources, and I'm going to speak outside of the RA resources for the California ISO that have some must offer obligation. We don't have an observation for that for other BAAs that will join the EDAM. However, there is an expectation that each BAA that joins EDAM will have to pass the resource sufficiency evaluation for reasons that we discuss in the slide next. And for that to happen, since the resource sufficiency evaluation is using bids, some level of bids have to be submitted to pass the resource sufficiency evaluation. So you can say that this is an expectation. You can take it to the next level and say, okay, this is mandatory because we expect every EDAM BAA to pass the RSC test so that we don't have the negative consequences of not passing the RSC test. But beyond that, the participation from a resource is really voluntary. So additional bids that could be used as economic displacement for running the market, these are optional. If you submit a bid and you clear the market, you will get a day-ahead schedule. The day-ahead schedule will be your reference for measuring and settling imbalance energy in EIM, and that's why you need to follow EDAM with EIM. That's why it is a prerequisite for participation in EDAM to also be in EIM. If you don't submit a bid in the day-ahead market, you will not get a day-ahead schedule. So all the participation is going to be in EIM. Your meter will set up all the energy produced or consumed to be an imbalance. So that's an option. We don't see as any additional obligation to participate from a resource level in EDAM beyond what is absolutely necessary to pass the resource sufficiency evaluation. So that's about the resource participation. And the other element that has been brought into question and discussion was the transmission participation. And I want to distinguish here between transmission, which is internal to a BAA, all right, and transmission that is on interties between BAAs. For internal transmission, as is the case in EIM, the market does not observe any specific ownership or limits on participation for internal transmission. Everything that is in the network model that is submitted by a BAA, which we incorporate in our market, is really available, is always available. The limits there for this transmission are either set due to thermal limits or reliability limits, but not limits in the sense that I want to only release a certain portion of transmission to the market. I want to reserve the rest. All of it is available if it's not on an outage, right? So for internal transmission, there's no question about participation. All of it is available. That's how we run EIM. That's how we run the day-ahead market for the ISO today. That's how we propose to run EDAM. The issue may be raised for transmission between BAAs, which is designated in the form of transfers. And there we pair these transfers with these pre-proposed transmission products, which, we named them bucket 1, bucket 2, and bucket 3. For bucket 1, because this is required for the resource sufficiency evaluation, you can view this as required participation. If you need to have assistance from other BAAs in passing the resource sufficiency evaluation test for your BAA, and you rely on transmission for making that happen, that transmission is bucket 1 transmission, has to be declared in the market. Again, because it's driven by the resource sufficiency evaluation. But for additional transmission, bucket 2 and bucket 3 as of at this point, and it's part of the discussion that we're going to have in the sister working group on transmission, the initial proposal is for this to be voluntary. Because you don't really need it necessarily to run the market and clear the market. It's additional transmission that can be used for economic displacement, so for having an efficient market outcome. Of course, because we do believe that there is a lot of efficiency and revenues, because we introduced the concept of transmission revenue now in EDAM, there are enough, more than enough, probably incentives for every BAA that participates in EDAM to release this kind of transmission, because there are benefits to everybody. So we expect that transmission like that will be made available. However, at this point, the initial proposal is not to have it as mandatory. It is still voluntary. So I wanted to set a little bit the stage here so that we know we had a lot of questions on this. There may be a lot of misunderstanding of what we mean, what one term means, and etc. So maybe now we can set up a stage so that we can have a discussion, make sure that all these concepts are understood, so that we can move forward. One item that I sidestepped was external resource participation. As I mentioned, internal resources participate with bids. The level and allowance of external resources to participate will be a subject of discussion in the relevant working group. So I don't want to get into this right now, but that will be also possible to discuss and decide on how external resources and at what extent they will be able to participate in EDAM. So before I go into the resource efficiency evaluation here on the slide, I'd like to open up to see if I raised more questions by saying all this, and make sure we have a good base moving forward.
Yeah, no, thank you, George. That was great. I do see Callie in the queue. Go ahead, Callie.
Hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. George, I apologize. There's been a lot of information thrown at us over the last couple of days through all the 3 different working groups. So I had a question on the bucket 1 transmission participation. So yesterday in that working group, they were talking about how bucket 1 is required to the extent you have to provide enough transmission to support your RSE showing, which obviously this is still a detail to be worked out, whether or not that changes hour to hour. But you were talking about bucket 1 as really only focusing on transfers between BAAs?
Yes. Yes, it's very important to understand that these different buckets, these transmission products, are introduced and discussed in the context of EDAM. It's really transmission between BAAs. We never consider having transmission products internal to a BAA. Internal to a BAA, all the transmission that we see in the network model is available. We don't observe ownership. Any congestion that is collected is distributed based on existing congestion allocation process that we have in EIM. So anything that we talk here regarding to bucket 1, 2, and 3 transmission, we refer to transfers between BAAs.
Okay, that's helpful. So when you were talking transmission participation and you were kind of aligning the day ahead with EIM, and you were saying all the internal transmission is available and you see it in your model, that would also be true for EDAM. These buckets of transmission is just between the BAAs. Do I have that right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. I was just really trying to hone in on that transmission participation that you just mentioned versus what's going on in the other working group. So that was helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Callie. All right, I see Stuart next in the queue. Go ahead, Stuart.
Thanks, Mark. Happy New Year, George. Two questions. First question, can you just expand on load? There was questions previously around bringing, partial load to EDAM versus the load forecast for the full BAA. Can you just put a pin on what is required from an EDAM perspective when it comes to the BAA load, please, first?
Yes. Thanks, Stuart. And this really comes again in terms of bids, right? Participation from resources and that includes load resources, is declared in the form of bids, and that is for the IFM application. So in IFM, you have load bids. So you can get a load position, load forward position in the day-ahead market by having a load schedule, a day-ahead schedule, which then is used in real time to assess imbalances and imbalance deviation settlements. There is no such obligation for load to bid 100% of the demand forecast in the IFM. That's why we have bids. There is an expectation that load serving entities will probably bid some considerable amount of load as a hedging mechanism and mitigating the risk of having all of it showing as an imbalance in real time. But this is up to them how they want to manage this business. And as far as IFM goes, we just consider bids submitted by load. For the rack application, of course, there we want to make sure that we have enough reliability capacity procured in the day-ahead market to cover the demand forecast. The demand forecast, there is a question there: which demand forecast we're going to use? The one that the ISO produces, or the one that the EDAM BAA produces? That's a question that we need to discuss and decide here. In my view, we should use the best forecast. Which forecast is the most accurate? And this is sort of like what we're using in EIM today. We have an EIM forecast, an EIM BAA forecast, using our forecasting models. But if an EIM BAA has sufficiently justified reasons and proof that their forecast is better, we could use theirs. There is a mechanism like that today, and I assume we'll have a similar process here in EDAM. So there's a little bit of difference between IFM and RAC. In IFM, we have load bids. In RAC, we have the demand forecast, whatever that demand forecast is going to be. Did that answer your question?
It does, George, and I think there needs to be a broader discussion on load forecast and making sure that the forecast versus the accuracy is within a certain percent, and maybe that folds itself into the uncertainty component, because obviously if the forecast, irrespective of which one's better, CAISO or the EIM BA, is off by a certain amount, and then you compound that variation with the uncertainty, it becomes problematic. So that's extremely helpful. The second question I had, and I appreciate that, and Jeff clarified yesterday on the must offer obligation, so I appreciate the clarifications and must offer. The second component I have really ties to working group 3. And working group 3, there's discussion about whether GHG costs are included or not. But just as you said earlier, I mean, there's a transition from day ahead to real time, and I was struggling a little bit yesterday on working group 3 how there could be bids potentially day ahead that didn't include necessarily GHG, whereas in real time they do include GHG. I don't believe there can be a disconnect between the approaches when it comes to day ahead and transitioning into real time, in that the GHG is either all in or it's not in at all. Can you clarify that for me, please?
So, George, I'm going to pause you there. I think that question is definitely appropriate for the GHG working group, and let's address that there for everyone else that's in attendance. Stuart, good question, but I think we should hold that one.
It's to do with the fundamental. Let's take even the GHG aspect out of it. Fundamentally, whatever is done in EDAM has to be done. Whatever's done day ahead there has to be consistent between day ahead and real time. Is that is that a good principle? Is that? Would you agree?
As a term of principle, yes, and it will make operational sense as well. I know we already have mechanisms for accounting greenhouse gas cost in the EIM, and one of the proposals that will be discussed in the working group 3 is to really leverage that mechanism and use it for EDAM. There are other ways potentially for doing it in EDAM, but then they have the problem of this disconnect that you're mentioning. So this is definitely something for consideration and discussion in that working group. But as a principle, I agree with you. We need to have consistency between the markets.
Right. Not trying to prejudge a decision, and it should be a discussion for Working Group 3, but it certainly would throw a span on the works if there is inconsistency. I would expect. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Stuart. All right, I saw Bobby Olson. I saw you in the queue.
Yep, I've been raising my hand and lowering it, so I apologize. But I think I just wanted to, it's a little bit of a reverse card. I was trying to jump in there when Callie was asking her question and George was responding in terms of whether or not bucket transmission transfers were just BA to BA or if there is internal components. And I think George's response is right that the buckets largely are focused on transfers from BA to BA, but there may be some transmission elements within a specific BA, depending upon exact configurations, that may have bucket 2, bucket 3 in there. But George's overarching statement was, I think, consistent with what my expectations and understanding have been, which is, in general, as much of the transmission system within any given BA is expected to be optimized as part of EDAM as well. So just wanted to provide that as kind of a comment from my perspective and make sure that there's not necessarily a disagreement from that statement. George, if I'm off or if certainly something we may need to discuss further if that understanding is off.
No, I mean, I agree with you that it would be nice to have a flexible model that could even look at transmission inside a BAA, but I'm constrained here in my responses with knowing the capability that we have, the technical capability that we have, and currently we rely on the concept of a BAA boundary, and then we define a transfer as transmission between those BAA boundaries. So we're limited by the current technology in the way that we have designed it for EIM to consider these transmission products being between BAAs. Going inside the BAA will essentially require to break the BAA into parts, and then your result will be a much more complicated system to deal with. I think it's not impossible to think something like that, but I think for starters here in our EDAM discussion, our EDAM design, my view is that we should limit the discussion on bucket 1, 2, 3 transmission, or generally transmission products as transmission between BAAs. There are some elements that have transmission inside a BAA at some, we have grandfather contracts, we have concepts in the California ISO network model that, they realize certain physical and economic priorities for transmission and the transmission ownership rights or existing transmission contracts. We do have these concepts. They're different than the transmission product that we consider here in EDAM. To the extent that these existing concepts for high priority transmission internal to a BA can be leveraged and extended wherever this is needed and required, because it's complex, to other BAs that may join EDAM. We can talk about that, as we have talked about that in our EIM discussions with EIM participants, that they brought up these concepts for discussion. So that is always available and open. But I think in the context of this EDAM discussion here, when we talk about the transmission products under bucket 1, 2, and 3, etc., we need to focus our discussion on transfers between BAAs.
Okay, no, that works, George. I appreciate that.
All right. Moving on, Robert, I've seen your hand up in the queue for quite a while. I'm doing a time check. We have about 13, 14 minutes before we should be concluding the RSC purpose. So we'll take one more call after this, and then we'll dive into the purpose of the RSC. And then to the extent it's a transmission-related inquiry that doesn't necessarily have a heavy impact or change the way we walk through our discussion, transmission GHG, let's hold those for the appropriate working group so that those working group members get the benefit of George's answers.
All right, can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. This is Robert DeLizo from WAPA. I think George alluded to this modeling of, I guess, conforming and non-conforming load. I guess my question revolves around, I guess, how this plays out in terms of, resource showing. What impact does that kind of difference in loads is going to have on resources?
Yeah, well, maybe there is a misunderstanding here, because the term conforming or non-conforming when it comes to load really means whether this load is part of the general load that can be forecasted and it's part of the demand forecast model, or whether it's a load that exhibits salient features and characteristics that cannot be captured by demand forecasting models, and therefore it has to be modeled separately from the general load that is under the demand forecast. And this is load that is either participating load in terms that it has some demand response, or maybe it's a storage resource that can charge. And we have models developed for these non-conforming loads. But as it comes to participation, again, it's the same discussion that we had earlier. It all comes down to bids. So even these loads that are non-conforming, they have individual resources. They're not part of the general load at DLAP or ELAP or LAPS, whatever loads we have as general load distributed there. These specific loads, they have the ability to submit bids, and by that they declare their participation. And any load can submit bid in the IFM, conforming and non-conforming, using their particular resource model. So I think I don't see a difference in terms of participation, whether you're conforming or non-conforming.
Thank you, George. How about the resource showing part of it? We're required to show resources that cover both types of load, basically, that's what you're saying.
Yeah, that is a more difficult question that I don't think I can answer completely. All the showing that we have is really focuses on meeting your demand forecast. So we're talking generally about load that is part of your demand forecast, because this load, it has a characteristic that is exhibiting a pattern that can be forecasted in real time, and you don't have bids in the real-time market for that load. Non-conforming load, because it could be demand response or something that is not driven by forecast. We have bids for that load, so they're not part of this process. This load can bid. You can turn it around and see it as being part of the supplies, like negative supply. So when it comes to the showing, I think when we generally say we want to have resources covering your demand, we mean the forecasted part of the demand, what can be forecasted. Because other loads that they have their own bids, it's like they're really participating load. They're like any other supply resource. It's just the supply is negative, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay, that kind of helps. Thank you, George.
All right. So from a timing standpoint, George, I do see a few others in the queue. I'm going to hold off on getting to those individuals. If you don't mind walking through the purpose of the RSC, and then maybe we'll pause a second to the extent we have time for questions.
Yes, thank you, Mark. Okay, so why do we need the resource sufficiency evaluation? I think we have discussed this on and off in the past. We want some measure of responsibility in terms of the BAAs that participate in the EDAM, that they're capable to meet their own reliability requirements from their own resources. So if I am to define what the purpose is for the resource sufficiency evaluation, is the first bullet, that we want to make sure that its EDAM BAA submits sufficient physical schedules and bids with enough capacity and ramp capability to meet the reliability requirements which are meeting the hourly demand forecast and the associated uncertainty requirements, and the hourly ancillary services requirements. So that covers the capacity part. There is also a flexibility part that we have to make sure that is met, which is have sufficient flexibility, in essence, ramp capability in the resources that participate. And again, participation is declared with submitting bids, okay? So that cumulatively across hours, you can cover how much your demand forecast and uncertainty changes across hours. And there is also an extension of that. We need to look at consecutive hours too, because you can probably meet the flexibility that's required from 1 hour to the next, but as your resources are exerted in one direction or the other, their flexibility is inevitably reduced. So if the ramp capability of the requirements that you're trying to match is proceeding in that direction through consecutive hours, you need to make sure that you have sufficient flexibility to cover the set of hours that are moving in the same direction. So that's why I mentioned the cumulative requirements met across consecutive hours. So you can see that the test, you can say, has sort of like two flavors or two parts. A capacity part, that you have enough bids in the market, enough capacity under bids, which shows participation, to cover your requirements for any given hour, and then enough ramp capability within these bids to cover flexibility that is required across hours. Now, when we do this resource efficiency evaluation, we have associated the bucket 1 transmission, and again, this is transfers between BAAs, as part of this analysis to assist in BAAs having assistance on contracts between themselves participating in EDAM, so that if a BAA needs external transmission from and resource capacity and flexibility from another BAA to pass the RSC, then they can use a bucket 1 transfer to declare that in the market as a form of bid, so that we can take into account the resource efficiency evaluation and make sure that we support the concept that we have talked about earlier regarding, energy bid transfer. It was a little bit nebulous in that part, but now it takes a very concrete form. That what does this mean? We mean that we reserve intertie transmission capacity under a bucket 1 transmission product to be used for exactly this purpose, to have assistance from one BAA helping another BAA passing the RSC test. And there was a question in the past that we had in the last few days here. How does the RSC relate with this market? Is it the RSC for the IFM? Is it for the RAC? So the RSC is really a screen that we run before the market, and the RSC is not associated with any specific market. Let's say at 10 o'clock we close the market. We have all the bids. We have all the declaration of the bucket 1 transmission. We need that to run the RSC. And then we perform this test. We make sure that each EDAM BAA can meet its own requirements with these bucket 1 transfers in place. After that, when we run the market, everything is available for optimization, for economic displacement. So all these transmission products can be used for economic displacement. The fact that the EDAM BAA is meeting its own requirements is not relevant at that stage, because it can actually have energy flowing in through, say, bucket 2 transmission from another BAA and have its more expensive resources back down. So that is the natural outcome of the participation in the market. So you have two phases. The RSC is not a market. It's just a screen. We use the bids, we perform the test, and then when we go to the market, we just run the bids and we optimize everything. And that's all the economic displacement is happening in the market. And that's why I said earlier, because of this effect, we do expect that bucket 2 and bucket 3 transmission will be offered by EDAM BAAs voluntarily, because there's a benefit that is realized for the entire market, for all market participants. Let me open up for questions on this very high-level concepts.
Absolutely. Thank you, George. Dan, I see you in the queue, and then I'm going to go to Jeff Spires and Jeff Nelson afterwards. Dan?
Thanks, Mark. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. I'll try to be quick. George, so in talking through this, is it the ISO's intention that the EDAM BAs would have a IFM process like CAISO's and then also have a RUC process through EDAM, or were you speaking just about the CAISO BA and its processes when talking about IFM and RUC?
Thank you for this question. That is a very fundamental question. I'm glad you asked it because it may not have been evident in what I was saying here that we do perform an RSC and then we follow up with the market. So we already have a day-ahead market with its extensions and additions for the day-ahead market enhancements initiative. The purpose of our working groups here in EDAM is not really to redesign that day-ahead market, but to expand it, all right, for other BAAs beyond the ISO BAA to participate altogether in a day-ahead market. So what we debate here and discuss are the additional elements that come into the picture because of this expansion. What are these additional elements? The transfers, the transfer revenue, and its allocation. But the fundamental elements of a day-ahead market, which is an integrated forward market that produces day-ahead schedules, all right, followed by a reliability unit commitment that produces or procures reliability capacity to meet your demand forecast and essentially substitute for virtual supply and virtual demand if that is in play for the specific EDAM BAA. These are all elements of the existing day-ahead market. We don't really redesign that part. This is there. We're just expanding it. So that's why we're focusing here on the transfers, which are the new elements, the transmission revenue and its allocation, if there's going to be CRRs on outside the ISO, you know, all the things that we have in the scope. Virtual bids for EDAM BAAs, are they there? Not? What are the conditions of participation for virtual bids? And all these other things. These are the new elements that we need to consider. But we're not going to really have a look at the existing fundamental aspects of the day-ahead market, which is an IFM followed by RUC. Yes, this is going to be available for all EDAM BAAs. That concept does not change. Is that clear?
Yeah, to be honest, I mean, for someone who's participated in this for 3+ years, that's the first time I've heard it spelled out like that. And I think it'd be really helpful for entities to just have a timeline continuum for the day-ahead market that represents maybe how you are thinking about it conceptually now, just as far as how the pieces stack together. And I think that gets to your last bullet about passing the RSE and then moving into the actual market run, but just showing the sort of continuum there, and also inserting within that how entities and when entities would be expected to transact these bid range products that I think are your bullet 2 there, so that they would get counted within the RSE, but having those transactions taking place before the day-ahead market transactions that are optimized through the market clearing itself. So that was, I guess that was just the kind of the gating question there. I think the other outstanding question too, and I don't think it's one we can answer today, but just we probably need a update on what your latest thinking is on the day-ahead market enhancements, just to have a concept for how some of these pieces fit together with the imbalance reserve products, the reliability capacity products, or wherever those seem to be headed. So we're all kind of on the same page there.
Yeah, thank you for that comment, and I believe there's going to be an upcoming or 2 upcoming stakeholder meetings, calls on the day-ahead market enhancements. So we'll take that into consideration, and we should probably cover a little bit of time in these day-ahead market enhancements meetings on where we see expansions at touch points with this effort in EDAM to make a connection.
That's great. Last comment is just I'm hoping that you get invited to the work group 2 meetings, because I have some questions there that I think you'd be the best one to answer, but I don't want to bog us down today.
Yeah, I'm in all the meetings.
All right. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, George. All right, so I saw Jeff Spires in the queue. Jeff, I don't see your hand anymore, but I don't know if your question was answered or if you had a comment.
Hi, Mark. It's Jeff Spires with PowerX. I did have a question, so thanks for catching that. I'm not sure what happened. Hi, George. Just a couple of things. I did have a question about an earlier part of the conversation, but first, I just wanted to add to what Dan was saying in response to your comments. I think I'm also somewhat, I guess, a little bit surprised just about your comments there to do with basically suggesting that EDAM is essentially an extension of the CAISO's existing day-ahead market as is. And it really, I think, ties back to similar comments I've made on some of the previous calls, which is I really continue to think that a forum to have a higher level of discussion around the vision for EDAM, what it is and what it isn't, is important, because, you know, somewhat like Dan, I think that's the first time I've heard it articulated that way. And I think back to some of the principles and elements that the EIM entities had put forward a few years ago, probably 2019. One of them being that, you know, we really wanted to strive for a workable design for a regional market, and trying to emphasize the importance of being open to developing approaches and market design elements that work for a broader footprint, as opposed to you know, assuming that the existing market structure will work to simply extend that beyond California to some of the other BAs in the West. And so, you know, again, that's just another fundamental element that I think is worthy of discussion and debate beyond just the work group setting. So I just wanted to make that briefly. The other question I had for you was, you know, up front, you started talking through your view of the participation requirements for resources and transmission, and I thought that was very helpful, and again, another high-level discussion that is important to get us all a common understanding about. I just wanted to follow up with a slightly more detailed question around that to understand better how you're thinking about this. So maybe just a kind of a simplistic example, but if I have an existing resource under contract that in today's world I bring back to my system to meet my load. I'm not optimizing it. I'm just physically scheduling it on out transmission back to my system using an E-tag. And I want to continue to do that under the EDAM paradigm. What does that look like? I think I understand, at least from a sufficiency perspective, but if you could just elaborate on how do I do that, and how does it kind of flow through the market and settlements of EDAM, the way you're thinking about this?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think this is important to make sure that the design that we're thinking here is compatible with its existing concepts, and it doesn't preclude bilateral transactions. It actually accommodates them, and the way to have that happen in your example is through self-schedule. So you can have a self-schedule from your supplier resource and a self-schedule from your load resource in the IFM. Those are high priority schedules that will be scheduled aside from economics, unless of course there's some transmission limitation. But since you have secure transmission for this, that shouldn't be the case. So then the self-schedule will be clearing the market, and you will have a day-ahead schedule that will reflect your contractual arrangement. And yes, there will be a settlement based on the LMP. This is price taker, so you don't have the ability to set the price. You have to bid economically for that, which you have the option. You can have a contract which allow for perhaps a substitution of the energy from the market if it's at a lower cost than it costs you to generate it. But even if the contract is requiring physical, delivery and production, then you can do it through self-schedules. It's as we do it today in the EIM. You can have self-schedules.
I was following you until I guess the last statement you made confused me somewhat when you referred to the EIM, because when I think about the EIM, I've got the concept of base scheduling, so I can, I obviously come into the market with, under that situation with a base schedule that would represent that physical delivery from resource to load. So, but I think what you're suggesting is a self schedule where you, in effect, settle the generation as a sale, and then you separately settle the load as a purchase through the EDAM.
Yes, and you're right. In the EIM, you have the concept of the base schedule, which is like a surrogate day-ahead schedule, and it doesn't get a settlement. But if you have a contractual obligation that materializes after the day-ahead market frame, so it's after the base schedule submission, it's outside the base schedule, you can still declare it as self-schedule in the EIM, and it's similar to what we're suggesting here. Now, in the day-ahead market, there is no base schedule. There's no concept of a base schedule, and that's why in these bullets here, you don't see anything that pertains to a balancing test. There's no such a thing anymore. We're only making sure that demand forecast and uncertainty is met. So there, you don't have a base schedule, so you will be able to do what you were referring to through self-schedules, which are price taker bids, essentially, in the market.
Okay, thanks for that, George. I do have some follow-up questions, and I think there are some related questions to that example associated with transmission priority and how, in that example, the priority of the OAT rights being used would be contemplated through the market. I don't think we need to get into that here, but it might just be worth putting some thought to where that best fits, if that's the transmission discussion or where some of those more detailed questions might go in terms of the workshops. But I appreciate the responses. That's helpful.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you, George and Jeff. And I think these working groups show that, the California ISO is definitely open to any, talking about and discussing any adaptations or modifications that's needed to support EDAM. So I appreciate your comments, Jeff, and, working group 2 is probably best from a transmission priority standpoint for that question and discussion. Jeff Nelson, I appreciate your patience.
For getting to me. So first, George, the other questions kind of addressed it or partially did, and they really tied back to what the expectations were on the demand bidding. And I heard you articulate that you're expecting a RUC process, and it helps answer the question of the demand bidding. You also mentioned virtual bidding, which I think is an unknown right now if it's going to exist elsewhere. But that also goes into, I think, the ultimate answer on what are the obligations for demand bidding. If you recall, the ISO prior to virtual bidding, LOAD did have I forget if it was a bidding or a scheduling requirement before virtual bidding kicked in. So those pieces seem to all fit together. So thank you for clarifying that you do anticipate a RUC process. The other question, and this may be, I'll try to be quick on it, is that there may be a BAA that's participating in EDAM. Great. It's getting some of its resource efficiency from its internal stuff. Great. It's getting some of its resource efficiency from another BAA that's participating in EDAM, and that sounds like a bucket 1 transmission connecting that. But it may be getting some of its efficiency from a BAA that's not participating. How does that work with the resource efficiency test?
Yes. So this hinges on the concept of external resource participation, and whether there's going to be intertie bids at the boundary of the EDAM market footprint, and these concepts are up for discussion in this work group. So
Okay.
I don't want to, set the stage going in one direction or the other. I'd rather leave that for discussion when it comes up, and we'll lay out the advantages, disadvantages, pros and cons, and we'll discuss about it. We'll see what is the
and just sort of the corollary to that is that there may be people in the current ISO that have resource adequacy that's being met just by imports. And we were pretty clear on the principles that those type of transactions needed to be honored within the RSC.
That's
Thank
right.
you.
That's right.
Thank you, Jeff. All right, I see a few more hands, but I'd like to pose a question to the audience. George, thank you for describing what EDAM participation, at least from an ISO standpoint, what you guys perceive. But does what George described align with what all of you foresee EDAM participation looking like? I would like to get some feedback from the various entities out there to ensure, see where you are and how you envision that participation. Tong, I don't know if your comment was related to that, but I know you've been in the queue for quite a while, so I'll go to you. But, to the extent you want to comment on that question, please raise your hand and we'll get to you.
This is Tong Wu from WAPA. I'm not sure my question is related to how we intend to use EDAM. My question was related to the resource sufficiency test. If you want me to hold off my question, I can do that.
Go ahead, Tong. Go ahead and ask your question regarding RC.
Okay. I have a few questions regarding the uncertainties. I think the resource sufficient test for EIM and real-time is a little bit different from the resource sufficiency test for the day ahead. A lot of uncertainties that shows up in real time may not show up in day ahead at all. Yesterday, I was going through some of the potential uncertainties. I was thinking load forecast, there's uncertainty. Load may not be what is forecasted in real time, but in the day ahead time frame, you're not trying to resolve that issue. All you're trying to do is to match the load forecast with the resource. So there is no uncertainty in the day ahead optimization as far as load forecast is concerned. And then resource outages. You really don't know resource outage in day ahead. If there is a planned outage, then people should not be submitting bids for that resource, as long as that resource is not on those on the planned outage list. Then you have to assume that they're available in day ahead, so there is no uncertainty there. Transmission outage, same thing. By 9 a.m., if the transmission did not report outage, you have to assume the transmission is in service. So as far as day ahead is concerned, I don't know what uncertainties are. The only uncertainty I could think of was really congestion. That for market participants is uncertainty, because each individual market participant would not know whether there's congestion or not because they don't have all the information. But the ISO knows. That could be an uncertainty from market participants' point of view. So when they submit their resource showing, they say, okay, I have enough generation to meet my load, but I only see what I see. I think I can meet my load, but there might be congestions, so I cannot meet my load. Then I don't know. So that could be an uncertainty, and that requires some price-sensitive bid for the ISO to resolve those congestion. But that's my understanding. I just want to, show what I understand. So I don't know if George can provide additional comments on what kind of uncertainties would be considered in the resource sufficiency test.
Yeah, and I think as a group, you know, I would like the external participants and stakeholders to also opine on that. But I'm actually going, great question, Tong. I'm going to hold on that because that uncertainty, you know, clarification and definition, we're going to get into as one of those scope items.
Just Mark, just really quick.
Yeah.
Tong, I don't know if you were following up the day-ahead market enhancements process initiative, because there we do have a very clear description of what we mean by uncertainty in the day-ahead market time frame, and very specifically the elements that we consider as part of the uncertainty is the demand forecast and the solar and wind forecast, because you want to make sure that you commit resources in the day-ahead time frame to have enough capacity to be able to dispatch on in real time if this uncertainty materializes. Currently, we do not consider outages as part of that uncertainty. We don't evaluate that, try to quantify it. But as we have said in the past, in the flexible ramp product and the imbalanced reserve product that we consider for the day-ahead market enhancements, it's always up to us if we feel that there is a significant element of uncertainty contributor that right now we're not considering. We can make an effort to bundle it into our calculations for uncertainty. But these concepts, well, I was trying to point you out that they're already have been discussed in the day-ahead market enhancements initiative. We're not creating something new here. We're basically using that concept of uncertainty in this proposed resource efficiency evaluation for EDAM.
Thank you, George. All right, I want to do a time check. We're about 15 minutes past. I do want to go maybe to one more caller, and then we'll dive into some of the advisory showing discussion. Kathleen, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Thanks. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I'll try to touch on your question, Mark, but I had a couple things that I wanted to clarify. So one thing is, George, I heard you kind of talking about and noting that it had been communicated to you or prior discussion on Monday about the different market runs. I wanted to kind of clarify what at least I was meaning when I said that. Of course, RSE is not a market. What I mean is, and I'll just be very transparent, I also have a vision that I thought all the market processes would extend under the EDAM, so I can at least confirm that for Mark. But the RSE is calculated prior to the market run. But the question is not so much, it's about when do the failure consequences kick in. And so in my current thinking is that for IFM, I don't currently think that the failure consequences of the RSE should be impacting IFM. The voluntary bidding, it's voluntary market. It's also bid-in supply cleared versus bid-in demand, and I do envision virtuals being also supported to mitigate those risks, right? So consistent, keep it simple. But the RUC is a reliability run. I do think the failure consequences from the RSE should apply to RUC. So I just wanted to kind of highlight and answer Mark's question, and also highlight for you what I was getting at when I was bringing up, let's be clear about IFM versus RUC, and what my current thinking is. Open, of course, but that's what I meant.
Yeah.
Does that help? And with that, I would note. Oh, I just going to mention we didn't. There's just adding the bullet of, in addition to the purpose, it's after failing an RSE, failure consequences take effect. And then there's an open question about which markets they would take effect in. I think would be helpful just to round out your purpose slide.
Yeah,
I had a follow-up. Sorry.
But before you go on, I don't want to miss this concept here. It's good that you brought it up. It's important. It really depends on what will be the consequence for failing the test, which is up for discussion here. We haven't closed on that. But if we're going to follow up some process, what we have in EIM, where we limit imports or exports into and out of a BAA that fails the test in one direction, if that is the consequence, and I'm saying if, it's open to decide here what is the best way to handle this, but if that's the consequence, then it should apply in IFM for the simple reason that IFM actually procures imbalance reserve, right? So, and the purpose of the test is to make sure that its EDAM BAA is self-sufficient in meeting not only its demand forecast, which is something that we see in RAC, but also its uncertainty, which is something that's procured in IFM. Otherwise, it's possible that this EDAM BAA that failed the test, if we don't have some consequence reflected in IFM, then that EDAM BAA could very well lean on others in the IFM solution. So you don't want that. So all I'm trying to say is that it really depends on what will be the outcome of this working group discussions on what will be the consequence for failing the RSC. Then, depending on that outcome, then we'll figure out how do we model it in the markets plural, IFM and RAC. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And Mark, do you mind just noting that as an open scope item? If we don't already have it, that it's, if it got confused the last meeting, to make it a little clearer, that would be helpful. Because, you know, in my vision, IFM is a financially binding market, and the concept of leaning is a reliability concept. So I'm not there yet if that is a thing we are going to consider doing. So let's make sure that we have time to talk through that. The other thing that I'd say,
Kathleen, you can lean financially too. It's not only
so that is
reliabilities.
Why, and George, that is why virtual bidding was created for the gaps in this. So let's just keep it as an item. I have one more thing I wanted to ask to make sure scope is clear on, that we have time to talk about, is the second bullet. The devils are in the details. I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that at this point. It occurs to me that it sounds more like you're saying that you think in addition to a resource sufficiency test, you need a transmission sufficiency test in EDAM. And I think that the question probably needs to be elevated up to that level. What are you trying to say that certain tests in RFE need to include a deliverability check to be included, or are you trying to say that if there's sufficient transmission needs a separate test? And I think that that is complex enough. It needs to be its own deep dive.
No, I didn't mean it like that. It's a simple declaration, right? So, for example, let's say BAA1 provides imbalance reserve up for a certain amount, let's say 100 megawatts to BAA2, and it's using 100 megawatt transfer under bucket 1 from BAN to BAA2 for that. So once you declare that by 10 a.m., anyway, before we run the resource efficiency evaluation test, then we can take it into account and go to the RSC test for BAA1 and add 100 megawatts requirement on the uncertainty, because this is what they commit to provide to BA2, and BA2 subtract 100 megawatts from their uncertainty requirement, because this is what they're getting from BA1, and we know that this can happen because there is transmission set aside under this bucket 1 transfer between them. That's just a declaration and calculation concept. There's no feasibility, or we assume that the transfer is there, the capacity for the transfer is there, right?
Yeah,
so George,
Kathleen, George,
I'm trying to flag it.
Let me hop in here.
One response, and then I just want to say one thing, Mark, and then you can hop in.
Yeah.
All I'm trying to say is that I interpret these as not a foregone conclusion for a deck. So all I'm saying is it's an open question, because at this point, including the transmission buckets into RSE is not something that has been a decision. So let's make sure it's a question that we can discuss through these workshops. Thanks, Mark. Sorry.
Yeah, and I think we'll definitely vet those items out, in the coming weeks as we get to the scope list topics. In the interest of time, I am going to move on. I do see several individuals in the queue with a question. I apologize. To the extent there's time at the end of this, we'll hop in on that. George, I really appreciate you kind of laying the groundwork, resetting expectations as to, what the ISO envisions EDAM, and really setting the stage for the purpose of the RSC. So I appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Mark. I just want to close here with, it's very important. The only reason we're considering this bucket 1 transmission is with relation to the RSC. So let's don't lose sight of that. Bucket 1 transmission is integrally related to RSC. That's all I have to say. Thanks.
All right. Next slide, please, Christina. All right, so relevant guiding principles. So this kind of goes back to the advisory showing. The RSC should ensure that entering the day-ahead market, EDAM entities can meet their individual capacity and other balancing authority area obligations based on conditions expected in the day-ahead timeframe in order to prevent leaning on other EDAM entities, right? So there was a supporting key concept in this guiding principle that states EDAM entities will make advisory, resource sufficiency, or equivalent showings in the month-ahead timeframe. And, these are intended to be advisory. That's something we're going to be discussing through this forum. It's RA-like from a California ISO standpoint. And the intent of this advisory showing is really intended to provide an indication of the progress of the entities as they move towards that resource sufficiency in the month-ahead timeframe. Next slide, please. And once we get into and I start posing these questions, I will definitely call on some of those who help build these principles and see if there's anything else they'd like to add from a contextual standpoint. So, the first question I pose to the audience, right? Who provides the forecast? Who's responsible for that, right? I'm not looking to define what exactly that forecast is. Does it make sense for the California ISO to establish that forecast, or does it make sense for the EDAM participating entity to provide that forecast? Is there going to be a common methodology for this forecast? Let me pause there and see if I can get some external weigh-in. Jeff, I see your hand up, Jeff Nelson.
Actually, my hand was stale. If there's other hands, please take those.
Okay, sounds
Unless
good.
you want me to chime in, I never sure.
Yeah, feel free. If to the extent you would like to weigh in on this, I'd appreciate it, Jeff.
Yeah, just the concept was that we have a 45-day showing in California. It gives us a little advance warning if there's going to be trouble coming. And the concept was, even though this was non-binding, it would at least give us an idea if we thought there was trouble coming and give us a month and a half to try to do something if we saw trouble coming. That was sort of the concept behind it, rather than just wait till the day of and start failing sufficiency tests. And then it's like too late to do anything. So, in California, we generally have like the CEC and the PUC sort of agree to forecasts. So if, in my view, if other balancing authorities have a similar sort of a regulatory process where a forecast is agreed to, using those other regulators or that agreed state process, probably be a good forecast. But I really should let the people that will have to do this chime in, but that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Jeff. So as it relates to that first question, that's what I'm looking for comments on. So to the extent your comment is not related to that, I'm going to ask you to hold off, and as we get to that particular scope item, we'll address your comments and questions there. Stuart, let's go to you.
I think, Jeff, you partially answered the question as to the why, because I don't think this is necessarily needed, particularly when there's no co-optimization of RA at the moment. But I think the general point is it gives you a look ahead. I think, if you were to do that, obviously California utilities are doing it. I think it would be important not to create duplication if at all possible. So I don't know if there's some way either CAISO, if this was taken up and folks were willing to do this in a 45-day ahead process, if there's some way that either CAISO can pull it from whatever repository you folks are sending the reports at the moment, versus, maybe somebody suggested previously trying to input it in cyber and then also separately report to CPUC or whatever. I think that would be overly onerous. I think would you agree, Jeff, it's a nice to have rather than at the moment absolutely required, or what's your thoughts?
I think the principals thought it's a really good idea. The whole idea is, to be able to be comfortable that we're not only providing sort of economic value, but improving reliability as we expand the market out. So I think it's something the principals agreed to. So I'd be hesitant to say, we don't need it.
Okay, thanks.
All right, can I get maybe a Southwest entity to weigh in there, from the advisory standpoint, and maybe who should be on point for providing that forecast? And feel free to unmute yourself and speak up without raising your hand.
Actually, Michelle, the lines are muted now, right?
Yes, most are muted, yes. So if you tell me your name, I can definitely go ahead and unmute this.
Yeah, I see Justin Thompson from APS. Go ahead, Justin.
Hello, this is Justin Thompson with APS. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. We already have a lot of very complex processes. My recommendation is whatever we create here, we try to keep things simple. We've created some real Rube Goldberg devices here to make some of these things work. But my recommendation is have the responsible entity provide that forecast along with their resource mix or their resource total for whatever granularity we decide. So if we decide have a daily peak number, then have the responsible BA provide that information to the marketplace. Again, keep it simple. If for whatever reason that doesn't work over time, then let's make adjustments. But again,
yeah, I think simplicity is key. So thank you for calling that out. But you did mention something, Justin, that sparked a question. You mentioned sure. Does it make sense to have that daily peak number, right? So are we saying, or are you saying that maybe the showing is for that month, but it's also potentially you could have different shown resources spread out? Maybe resource A is shown in the first 2 weeks and a different resource in the following 2 weeks based on that associated daily peak number? Or are we looking for potentially a monthly peak number?
Just one of our experiences in Arizona is, I'll just use the example of May. From the beginning of the month to the end of the month, our peak load grows by 1,500 to 2,000 megawatts. So the answer may be quite a bit different in the beginning of the month versus the end of the month. Also, we are finishing up planned maintenance outages, towards the beginning of May, let's say. And so the available resources could be quite a bit different than towards the end of the month. So anyway, just maybe a suggestion, if we want to go to a daily granularity, we could, or just a monthly peak. Again, maybe keep it simple to start with, but if we need more data, then maybe we do daily granularity.
Oh, great point. So I'd like to hear if there's other stakeholders that would like to weigh in and whether or not they agree or see another variation of that. Do we have somebody maybe from the Pacific Northwest that would like to raise their hand that I could call on to unmute? Not seeing anybody pop in. So while we wait, let's go to Dan Williams. Dan, go ahead.
I'm unmuted now. Dan from CES. It was actually just a response to something you had on page 7. It was just questioning whether we've identified if the 45-day check would also be checking for transmission for external resources. It seems like with all the changes that are going on to the intertie market and kind of depending and maybe even removing the intertie market altogether, as we've known it, that there may just be different considerations for external resources that may have to deal with different congestion management moving across the West in the future. So I'm not sure if you've talked about if it's just resources counting, or if you're also looking at their associated transmission at that stage.
Yeah, so I know the original principles did not consider transmission, if I'm answering this frankly. With that, though, I guess I would, does it make sense to do that? Or maybe I can get an individual that was involved. You know, I don't know if we have Dave on the line, Kathleen, Kevin, Bobby, or Scott that would like to weigh in. I see you just popped up, Kevin. Go ahead.
Hey, Kevin Smith with Bank. You've already thought a level below where we were. So going back to the original concepts that were developed by the EIM entities, this predates, you know, this principal group that Jeff was describing. You know, there was nothing of this kind in there. And frankly, it was a very different construct back then on certain elements that even what CAISO had proposed. So really this came up in discussion with the PTOs primarily because of their 45-day RA showing. So it really is, you know, how am I generally going to meet my obligation? It's a non-binding. So putting specific transmission elements and other things that could be changed significantly between and even as Justin, I think I agree with Justin, we do intend this to be a simple test, because if it isn't, you know, again, we get into these complex things, people drop balls, there are mistakes that get made. So I think we want to keep this as simple as possible with sufficient, you know, and again, this is all going to play out over time. CAISO is going to have an understanding over time as to how accurate these claims are, and then ultimately we have to meet the RSE. But this was just something that we put out there as an idea, and the details are yet to be fleshed out, and that's part of what we're talking about now. So, you know, Dan's question is a good question, but it wasn't a level that we got to in our discussions. And I do think we need to keep this clean and relatively simple because there are a lot of variations among the BAs, just as Justin highlighted. I mean, May is a very different month depending on where you catch it, or it could be flat across the month, but we could have a significant spike, like as the Desert Southwest would be very different than, say, the Sacramento Valley. So anyway, that's my 2 cents on it.
Thank you, Kevin. So I heard APS's stance and SMUD's stance, you know, as it relates to the forecast. It sounds like that would come from the EDAM entity. Is there anybody on the line that feels or does not agree with that?
This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra.
Hey, Kathleen.
Would appreciate, yeah, hi. So I think an even simpler approach would be my proposal, but I have a couple things that I actually wanted to level set, but specific to who provides the information to answer your question. I think we should keep the same flexibility that we have, that we're providing through EIM, where either an EIM entity can provide their forecast or they can opt into a CAISO forecast. It seems a little premature to me to take that option away from EDAM entities when we give it to EIM entities. So I would flag that. I think it's more flexible and would make more people happy. Yeah.
That's the 45-day ahead forecast you're referring to, correct?
So I'm actually going to go there because, and this is why, so I'm going there next.
Okay, because that's where that's where this question is posed, Kathleen. Sorry, I wasn't clear.
Yeah. No, it's okay. But to be clear, the reason in the scoping on our Monday meeting, I asked for the question to be made more general to what timing we should be talking about, is because Vistra does not support a 45-day advisory showing. And so I'd like to share with you our vision, my vision, for what it would look like. Kind of in, and I like the way you're teeing this up, Mark, and asking us to put our cards on the table. So I want to do that for you. Okay, so here's what I think it makes sense in my mind. And the reason that we don't support a 45-day showing is that we're not talking about a forward market. We're talking about running an EDAM. and what's important and protecting against, testing for resource efficiency in a daily market. What's the right timing in our view is that I think that there should be an advisory run. Sure, 100%. EDAM entities need to be able to see the results and the inputs to it that we're providing to them through CMRI, so that they can see how they're tracking towards a consequence, either passing or failing in the binding run. The timeline that I think makes sense is a 2-day ahead ruck run as the advisory result. And so as I kind of teed up, like on Monday, bids are submitted into cyber. They can be submitted up to 7 days in advance. I don't think you need to run a 7-day ruck. I think that when the CAISO determines it needs to run a ruck, it can start printing those results and what inputs are driving it to CMRI as a result of whenever you run your ruck. So give that transparency. So let's say the CAISO only does a 2-day ahead ruck. That would be your advisory result. The EDAM entities could analyze, see if there's anything that they need to adjust between the T-2 and the morning of the day ahead run. So prior to the close of the day ahead market, they'd have time to go in and adjust their bids in response to the advisory results, and then the RFC that would run in the day ahead market processes would be the binding results also provided to them through CMRI. At this point, I don't see any need whatsoever for something farther in advance than the CAISO ruck run.
Thank you, Kathleen. I understand your position. I see Stacy in the queue. Stacy, did you want to opine? You may have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I got it. Okay. I just want to echo that. I'm Stacy, by the way, from WAPA DSW. We agree with Kathleen. We don't see the need for a 45-day ahead forecast. Even day ahead is like a 7-day or really we agree a 2-day ahead showing would be more realistic. And we kind of wanted to say that, we really don't think RS should be RA-like. And that's kind of where it looks like we're headed down the road of.
Thank you, Stacy. Jeff, I believe you were in the queue. Jeff Nelson?
No, I'm not. I'm done.
Okay, thank you. Tom?
Yeah, this is Tom Wu from WAPA. I think the forecast has to be hourly forecast. It cannot be monthly peak or even daily peak because WAPA is an entity or a sub-BA with primarily hydro resources. And we have capacity. Say CVP generation has 2,000 megawatt of capacity, but we do not have water to generate at a 2,000 megawatt per hour constantly for a day or for a month. And there's no need to do that. So it's not possible for us to show resource sufficiency for monthly peak or even daily peak. We can meet the load forecast, but we cannot show resources to meet the peak for 24 hours or for a whole month. So it has to be a RS, not an RA. And I think at the first meeting of this working group, we made it very clear it is RS and not RA. But lots of discussions led to like RA-like RS. That makes us impossible to show.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And let me maybe take a step back, or Jeff from SEE or Kevin, if you wanted to provide a little bit more context as to why, in those principal discussions, we saw there to be value in providing this 45-day ahead showing and see where the conversation goes from there. I'm hearing quite a bit of parties saying it may not be necessary, and they don't necessarily support it. So maybe if we can provide a little bit more context as to where the value was in providing that 45-day ahead showing, I'd appreciate it.
So I'm going to really defer to Jeff or PG&E if they choose on this, because this wasn't something that was organically raised by the EIM entities. This was just a level of comfort we're trying to get to with the entities that are already in the CAISO and some of the obligations. And again, just to de-emphasize, we're not trying to equate this to RA. We all understand the significant differences between RS and RA. The only commonality here is, the window that we kind of picked as a time frame, and we never intended this to be an onerous or binding type of exercise. So, but from our perspective, we're willing to try to find some reasonable level of accommodation and reporting if it provides the CAISO and other entities, some level of certainty or transparency that, as Jeff said, we're not going to be in a day ahead scramble. But, we're not wedded to it, but we're willing to deal with it, and we're willing to hold to it to the extent that others feel it's a necessary element of the market. So maybe Jeff, happy to hear your perspective, because I think, we all kind of came to this as a group, and I know it was, at least from your perspective, something that was an important element.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything you said, but I mean, I'll ask the other question. People aren't able to tell us 45 days in advance how they plan on keeping the lights on? I think that's absurd. And I think if that's really the case, then we have a much larger problem than putting an informational showing together as part of the EDAM market. So I'd say the whole point of this is to start building confidence. This is coming off the heels of a very, very tough summer, 2 summers back. Just sort of the show of good utility practice as part of the market design. And I think we owe that to the region. I think we owe it to our customers. I'm a little confused on why Generation is opposed, or Vistra was concerned about a non-binding showing in advance. This isn't going to go into an optimization. We're not talking about producing any market results with this. This is more of a showing to see if it looks like we're going to be okay, or if there's real reliability concerns, and giving us a little time to do something about it if there are.
Thank you, Jeff. Todd, did you want to add to that?
Hey, Mark, can I respond to Jeff's question towards me?
Yeah, real quick, Kathleen, please.
Sure. No, I appreciate Jeff asking the question. It's fair to ask for context. We'll level set to the group that I am speaking, I'm participating on this, of course, on behalf of my company, but I also have another hat that I wear. I'm one of the regional issues forum liaison for the independent power providers and marketers. And so one of my focuses in these conversations, and especially this one, is, are we thinking about the IPPs and marketers that participate in the EIM areas and what makes sense with that in mind? I think it is a mistake to only think about this from the perspective of an EIM entity. There are other types of participants in EIM, and something 45 days in advance does look like a forward capacity contract if you're saying a competitive generator who's not the EIM entity but is participating in the EIM entity area has to provide that commitment 45 days in advance. They better be on a contract, but they better be being paid for that, right? If you think about it from a commercial perspective. Whereas that's not what we're doing. We're talking about a daily market, and those entities do exist, and we need to make sure that they have the ability to be included in the RSC And I think a 2-day ahead is probably the only time period that makes sense. That's the context.
Thank you, Kathleen. And I noted your 2-day ahead advisory RFC, and I'll pose that question here in a minute. Todd?
Tom?
No, Todd Ryan.
Oh.
From PG&E. Hi, thank you for letting me speak. The 45-day showing to me was always about making sure and preventing leaning. We for the last 3 years, we've been discussion about EDAM. There's been numerous stakeholders concerned about leaning, and by providing an purely advisory showing for how a BAA is meeting its load and its obligations, would give time for that BAA to correct any deficiencies when we're talking about, bridging the gap between the RA time frame to the day ahead time frame. And so I understand hesitancy about the details in terms of lining up resources that far in advance, but a shorter time frame doesn't necessarily give a BAA an opportunity or an LSC an opportunity, sufficient time to go out and procure sufficient resources, procure transmission, and resolve the leaning that everyone's so concerned about. So I do think it's a fairly important part of the EDAM design. I also think it gives CAISO potentially opportunity to run simulations or potential analysis to make sure that it's going into the month operationally feasible. So as a whole, is the EDAM footprint. So those are my personal thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. And Todd or Jeff, I heard Kathleen state generation under contracts, and when I originally read through the principles and scoping items, and the word advisory kept coming up. Did you envision this being a generation plan that was already under contract, or
I
what
didn't.
the entity is planning to do? Oh, go ahead.
I didn't. Because it was non-binding, this was a plan. Now, they may have them under contract, and then they may have sort of a plug for we've got 90%, but there's still 10%, and they'd sort of put a plug in there. But no, I wasn't intending this meant that they had to be, contracted, signed 45 days in advance. But they've got a plan, 45 days in advance. They have a plan on how they're going to keep their lights on for that month.
Gotcha. Okay. So I want to do a time check. We're at about 2:46. We have 14 minutes. I thought there was a great deal of questions and a lot of information thrown at everyone today. I really do appreciate everyone's engagement. I think before we dive any further into this, advisory, are we going to do it at 45 days? I heard several parties in support of that. I also heard several parties in support of, maybe it makes more sense to do a 2-day ahead RSE run. Would that suffice in, the other side, Camp A's of 45-day ahead showing? I think that's something maybe we can take back and really think about. And, this coming Monday, let's be prepared to continue this discussion. So I just kind of want to set the groundwork as it relates to next Monday and what we can anticipate talking about, so everyone has an opportunity to think about that over the rest of the week and the weekend. If you guys would like to chat offline amongst each other, please do so. Reach out to me. I can help provide you the appropriate contact information for the various parties. I'd be happy to help facilitate any of those conversations with you guys. Oscar, I do see your hand up, so I'm gonna go to you. Go ahead, Oscar.
Hi. So I just want to give my opinion on the 45-day showing. So I know through the EIM, there's a clear bifurcation between responsibilities that are required from the market operator's perspective versus the responsibilities and obligations that are required for the balancing authority area. And I think we're kind of diving into that same fine line when we're starting to talk about EDAM and the 45-day showing, because that is something that's required. I mean, entity, and I agree with the comments that were echoed earlier, entities do plan accordingly to have resources available within the 45-day timeframe, especially balancing authority areas that are NERC/PERC obligated to meet reliability standards. But at the end of the day, on the BA obligation, is that really required on a 45-day basis? I think it just, I struggle with the idea of creating unnecessary requirements for a market that's operating on a day-ahead basis. And frankly, I think the RS showing, at least on a two-day basis, and that's obviously we're building to that framework of what are the appropriate consequences if an entity is shown not to be able to pass the RS. So again, I just want to emphasize that there is that clear bifurcating line between what is the responsibility of the market operator and what's the responsibility of the balancing authority area. Thank you.
Thank you, Oscar. I appreciate that. All right, so I'm going to skip ahead a few slides as we weren't able to kind of dive into, and nor did I fully expect us to fully hash out and have an answer for the advisory showing by the end of today's meeting. Bob, did you want to highlight anything you heard or anything like that prior to potentially asking for closing comments and going from there? And you may be on mute, Bob.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that I can summarize things. There's a lot of details discussed. I think I did capture the details, and in this last discussion, of course, we're trying to set out. It seems like there was two main points. Do we need this long-term showing, and potentially maybe an idea of a shorter-term potential check? So I think we've certainly captured those two concepts. It seems like that might be with more discussion later. That's I think. And then, of course, there's the questions that were raised about the participation questions and timing. So I think we'll probably have some more discussion on those topics too as we get into the topics later on.
Yeah, and I know our goal is to post the summation and summary of these conversations by close of business Thursday, potentially early Friday. So I would encourage the working group to definitely monitor that EDAM working group space so that you can see that summary of conversation. And, this last check-in slide, so I think we were able to accomplish some of our objectives today, so I think that's fantastic. We were able to go through the proposed order of topics. I think I didn't hear any pushback on, starting with the advisory showing, diving into the RSC, and then lastly, tackling the EDAM transfers. George was able to give us that foundational overview of EDAM participation. I think that was beneficial for all to kind of set the tone, and then reviewing the purpose of the RSC as well. Again, as I stated a few minutes ago, and as Bob just stated, I am hearing two parties, and I definitely encourage you to speak offline with each other. Let's see if we can kind of find some common ground, which is the purpose of these, or to the extent we don't find that common ground, we can always parking lot this item for later in the working group sessions. It is key to try to stick to those principal designs. That's how we got here today. So I would encourage you all to see if there is that common ground we can find. And a few more things to think about, right? We're not just going to talk about who sets the forecast, which I believe I heard it would be the entity setting that 45-day ahead forecast. We're not talking about the day ahead forecast and some of the other options that Kathleen briefly mentioned. That 45-day ahead forecast, what does that look like? Is it a daily number? Is it simply a peak monthly number? Do we include any reserve margin percentages? You know, start thinking about some of those things, and I would encourage you guys to come to Monday's meeting with some of those ideas and thoughts. You know, and also think about how specific does that information need to be. I heard it wasn't necessarily thought out to be contractually binding. It's, here's my plan going into the month ahead showing, here's what I believe I'll be able to procure. You know, what percentage of that forecast do you need to meet, right? Are we talking about 100% of that forecast? These are all questions for us to think about as a group before going into Monday's call. So the slide deck that you're going to see for Monday is going to be very similar to what you saw today as it relates to the advisory showing component. You do have the ability to reach out to us for questions. Everyone should have my contact information. I do encourage you to work through that website. And I look forward to transparency on, you know, what do we do with the information? So we get it all. What do we envision doing with that information? Is there a, you know, is it a CMRI report that everybody sees? Is it, you know, is it a SharePoint site? You know, not getting too far down into the weeds, but how do we provide that information? And what level of information should we be providing? So let me pause there. I see Dan has his hand up. We got about 6 minutes before we conclude, so I definitely want to give opportunity for Dan. Go ahead, Dan.
Thanks, Mark. Dan from CES. Just two quick things to think about headed into Monday. One is if someone can kind of bring to the table some touch points with the Western Resource Adequacy Program and what that may or may not be able to offer here as an analog to the process that the LRAs in California are going through and how that sets entities up and can be checked on a forward basis. And the second is as we get closer or when thinking about that 2-day ahead process, where does RC West fit in that discussion? And are there any things that CAISO is doing as an RC that could be valuable or could be a different way of kind of solving the issue that's trying to be addressed here? And I think at that point is maybe where the transmission ask that I had before comes in. You know, if the RCs knows that there's going to be a significant D rate on the COI or the DC, how does that get factored into assessing supply adequacy for the market as a whole? So just want to leave those open questions out there.
Thank you, Dan. Great questions. Eric? Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Hello, this is Eric Johnson with the City of Pasadena. And I was actually trying to respond to your question earlier when you asked about what George had said regarding the EDAM being an extension and a separate extension compared to the current day-ahead market. One of the reasons why we've been on all these calls is, as Pasadena as a current ISO participant in day-ahead market, is that we want to make sure that we're insulated from the things that could happen as we add on additional bodies like the EDAM. And the leaning is a big concern for us. So as we look at these things and want to understand how these could impact us, we want to make sure that we have a voice to actually tailor the new market to make sure that it keeps the current market whole. And if anything, it enhances the current market by adding additional resources and supply resources so that we can have the variety, so that we can have the liquidity, so that we don't see a rise in prices because we add EDAM. What we're looking for is the true benefits of an EDAM. The same way that we've seen those benefits come from an EIM. We've seen that more participants make it to where it's easier to actually get lower prices. Things that are committed in day ahead are then uncommitted in real time due to economic issues. And that's the kind of things that we're looking for. If those same resources then cannot even be committed in the day ahead, we could see them actually not have to start buying gas for gas-fired units or know that a unit's not going to run because it isn't needed. So a lot of what George said really rung bells for me because we're trying to make sure that we're insulated, and it sounds like that's the ISO's actual purpose with EDAM as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Callie?
Yeah, hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. I just wanted to offer a suggestion going into Monday, kind of adding to Dan's list there. As this discussion between kind of the 45-day versus a 2-day advisory RSA showing kind of occurred, something that I kept asking myself in my mind is, what is the purpose of this advisory showing? I know George gave a really good, discussion. There's a robust discussion on the purpose of RSA showing in general, but it seems to me like maybe this advisory showing has slightly a different purpose, and that it's not, can you meet your hourly load requirements, but maybe the purpose is, do you have a plan to get there? And I think if we maybe on Monday level set that, have that discussion ahead of time, then the answers that you just, pose in terms of more of the details, you might get different responses depending on what the overall purpose is of that advisory showing. So, again, does it have to be resource specific? Well, maybe the answer is yes, if the intention of it is to make sure you can meet your hourly load requirements, versus if it's just a plan, maybe it doesn't have to be that specific. So just kind of a more fundamental question that I think would be useful to have at the beginning of Monday, or before you start kind of going down the more detailed questions of what does this advisory showing consist of.
Yeah, thank you, Callie. And, I know I heard Jeff and Todd and a few others speak to it simply being a resource plan, but Todd, if I can give you Jeff, if I can give you that action item maybe to come back with on Monday to kind of help define that purpose and do a new level set, and then we can dive into some of these other questions. We are at 3 o'clock.
Mark, can I ask for one more note on this is Kathleen Goldberg from District. One more note, if you could add, is to that question Callie had. What is the purpose, and is that purpose appropriate within EDAM?
All right.
And I will save my substance for Monday.
All right. Well, I really appreciate everyone's time. I do look forward to our discussions on Monday. I know this is a heavy lift for everyone, so your engagement is key as we build out these items. So thank you, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.